So before actually speaking about this subject, which for some Muslims has become a challenge among other challenges, ideological challenges that Muslims are faced with today, I did want to begin by speaking about a couple verses of the Qur'an. The very first verse is what we know as Ayatul Kursi, which the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said is the most significant verse of the Qur'an, the most significant verse of the Qur'an. And this particular verse is one of the most significant because it highlights all of the most outstanding attributes of God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He not only exists, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is living, self-subsisting. All things rely upon the Creator for their sustenance and their existence. You know, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is omnipotent, He's omniscient, among other things. This is the most significant verse of the Qur'an. And then that is followed by another verse, verse 256 of Surah Al-Baqarah, which begins with the statement, La ikraha fid din. There's no compulsion in religion. There's no compulsion in faith. قَدْ تَبَيَّنَ الرُّشْدُ مِنَ الْغَيِّ. Right direction is clear, or made clear from error. So this principle of religion or faith being impossible to root in the heart of an individual by force is a hallmark of Islam, and it is a human reality that we do have injunctions in our tradition, such as apostasy laws, for instance, where governors have attempted to force Muslims to pray or force Muslims to recant any type of heretical statements which would put them out of the fold of Islam, right, by threatening them with death. And naturally, in such a situation, we know that a person who really values life will simply, do what he or she is told. And there is no guarantee for lasting peace as long as people do not accept things on conviction rather than compulsion. And the same thing can be said about every single other ideology or any moral system that has arisen in our times, be it liberalism par excellence, I guess you would say, in this times we're living, which is an extremely influential aspect of our existence right now, where Muslims are being pressured from many different directions. We find ourselves, or our brethren at least, our brothers and sisters in the Muslim world, being massacred now by their own governors, but even prior to that, massacred by the Western forces. So now it's both the Western forces and Muslim forces that are killing Muslims in their own lands, and then people fleeing from those lands, the refugees trying to find their way into Europe and other parts of the world, to at least feel some semblance of order, once again, some semblance of tranquility. Then on top of that, we have the ideological challenges. And those challenges, not so much from the conservative side, as we know, that we are morally conservative, even though we may not be politically conservative. And many times, or most times, Muslims are politically liberal, even though we're morally conservative. So we find ourselves in these very strange predicaments where we have to choose oftentimes to side with those who are morally liberal, right? And we take their political stance or side with them in political issues, but our hearts are somewhere else. And we are dissuaded, or we find a type of a nufra, or a type of repulsion away from the morally conservative members of Western society because of their very harsh political stances oftentimes. So we find ourselves in those situations. So we have to find a way where we can make those distinctions. We understand that because I may largely be politically liberal doesn't mean I have to become morally liberal. But more importantly, we should remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate determiner of our truths, of our ideas about good and evil. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So la ikraha fi deen, right? We cannot be compelled to accept any type of religion, or any type of ideology or faith, and even if we do so for political reasons, then our hearts are troubled, or at least should be troubled by the very fact that others are committing certain wrongs that our religion considers to be unethical. But then it goes on, قَدْ تَبَيْنَ الرُّشْدُ مِنَ الْغَيِّ فَمَنْ يَكْفُرْ بِالطَّاغُوتِ وَيُؤْمِنْ بِاللَّهِ فَقَدْ اسْتَمْسَكَ بِالْعُرْوَةِ الْوُثْقَى لَا انْفِصَامَ لَهَا. That whoever rejects faith in the false God and believes in God, then that person is taking hold of the firmest handle which does not break. Wallahu Sami'un Alim. So this is what this verse 256 tells us, and in one way, another way to put this is that this verse is reminding us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has exclusive right to legislate good and bad. That is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In al-hukmu illa lillah. That judgment belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. That whoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed, then those people have rejected faith. And there are so many different verses like this. أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِأَحْكَمِ الْحَاكِمِينَ. Is Allah not the wisest of all judges? And so in these troubling times when people are trying to take advantage of the very fact that Muslims are down and they're being softened up by wars and the pressures of American society, being demonized in the media, being pressured to constantly apologize for things that they didn't do, or people who are associated with them, and then some people jump in and say, now is the opportunity that we can force these people to not only tolerate us, but to accept us. And this applies not only in the realm of the homosexual ethics, or in transgender ethics, but also in the area of what we call feminism, which is an issue that I like to speak on, but speak on it in such a way such that we don't misunderstand what has been implied. That to speak about or against feminism, because there are many different waves of feminism, the first, second, and third wave of feminism. Speaking about feminism is not with the aim of ignoring legitimate women's rights issues, because there are definitely some legitimate women's rights issues. My caution is only against Muslims developing the habit of abandoning their own epistemology or their own sources of their own truths and their ideas about morality, only to adopt another's. Right. So, for instance, one of the guiding principles of feminism, or one of the unquestioned assumptions, is the idea that patriarchy is inherently evil. Patriarchy is inherently evil. And so what I mean by patriarchy is this idea of a society where men largely predominate all of the offices of influence, and they control women's lives. So some feminists, or many feminists, would see the relationship dynamics between a Muslim husband and a Muslim wife, where a wife is expected to obey her husband, as a situation of patriarchy and something which is unfair, it's unequal, that the relationship between a husband and wife in their eyes should be on equal footing with one another. So if the woman is expected to obey, then the man should also be expected to obey. And if the man is not expected to obey, then the woman should not be expected to obey as well, because there should be complete equality, total equality in the relationship according to the way they see it. The problem with this is that if I'm a believer, and once I now turn my gaze onto the Qur'an, and I open it up, and I have this assumption that the Qur'an, being a book from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which provides us with the most fair and just arrangements or relationships, or at least the picture of the best form of relationship between people and between the creatures and the world, then I would definitely not find anything patriarchal in the Quran, because patriarchy is inherently evil. Then I turn to Surah 4, verse 34, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ar-rijalu qawwamuna 'ala an-nisa. Men are the caretakers of women. Men are responsible for women, right? Then right there, there's a challenge. And that challenge is between me accepting that this particular injunction is something which contains wisdom in it, being that it is revealed or assumed to be revealed by the Creator of all creation, or me judging the Quran on the basis of this particular principle that I've come to accept, which is that patriarchy is inherently evil. And if the Quran says this, then either I have to give up this assumption, or I need to say no to the Quran. Right? Not understanding by saying no to the Quran, then I'm fundamentally saying no to God. If I'm a believer in the Quran, then it means that it is revealed by Allah. I believe it's revealed by Allah. But when my response is that of such a nature, then it fundamentally is a challenge to my own faith. It is, I can't show fidelity to both my feminist assumptions and to the teachings of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's just simply one example of this. So throughout the history of this movement, which is believed to have been started towards the end of the 1800s, and we call the first wave of feminism, that there are some legitimate concerns that women had. So for one, women couldn't vote, right? Now black men gained the right to vote before women in the United States. And so one of the grievances was that, well, if people have that much control over your lives and they can continue to oppress you and they lock you out of influence, you know, and then they can bring great harm to you. So people should be given the opportunity to occupy similar offices so that they themselves can protect their rights and the rights of other potentially oppressed minorities. So a legitimate gripe. That was at least one of the things that a part of that movement was about the voting rights and the sort of rights to work, among other things like that, which came out of that particular first wave of feminism, and very honorable aspiration. So, but then we find the second wave of feminism was started towards around like the 1960s, and the focus now turns to trying to even redefine, I guess you would say, certain assumptions about human nature. So for instance, the distinction between what we call sex and gender. Most people, I think, who haven't studied anything, any type of feminist epistemology or anything which has been influenced by feminist epistemology, don't know that a distinction is made between the terms, the words sex and gender. Like for these feminists, they highlighted for them is that sex is what we refer to is biological in nature. Sex is biological. You're born with your sex. You're either born as a male or a female, and that is determined by your anatomy. So sort of genitalia you have, among other things. So that is fundamentally, it's biological. But gender, in the view of these women, was that, and sometimes men as well, was that gender was socially constructed. That is to say that you may be born a male or a female, but you learn how to be a man or a woman. Somebody teaches you how to be or to act like a man or act like a woman. And that in itself is not necessarily completely in contradistinction to pre-modern ideas. That there, in the past, there were these beliefs that that manhood had to be taught and womanhood had to be taught. Right? There is an acknowledgement of a certain level of this. You know, so you have to be taught how to fight. You have to be taught how to hunt. You have to be taught how to protect your family. Right? And you have to be taught how to cook or to clean or whatever, to sew. That there are aspects of being a pre-modern man or woman which are clearly taught. However, what this clashed with was with ideas about, eventually ideas about psychosexual orientation. So an example I brought up some time ago, earlier today, when I was having a conversation over lunch, was that in the 60s there was a case called the John Jones case. And this particular case was one where there are two twin brothers, and one of them had a circumcision done and was botched. Right, so the little boy, 2 years old, his circumcision was botched. At the time, because of these ideas about psychosexual development being socially constructed and determined, certain doctors had approached the family of this little boy and said to them, well, we can just simply perform reconstructive surgery on this boy, and then you can raise him as a girl. He's still young enough not to really know exactly what he is, you know, and you can raise him as a girl. So as the child would grow up, and each year would go by, that they would inject the child with certain types of hormones, which makes him look more feminine as he grew older. And eventually, this particular case was held up as a success story, that to prove that your sexual orientation or your psychosexual orientation was determined socially. And so what it was hidden from the public was that the experiment was a failure from the very beginning. And it came out later that the little boy, who they now called Joan, you know, who started John B. Jones, which wasn't his real name, but you know, he had rejected the experiment from the very beginning. So he would play with what we would call boy toys as opposed to girl toys. He preferred those type of toys. When he's in the bathroom and he watches his mother putting on lipstick and sees his dad putting on shaving his face, instead of putting on lipstick, he wants to shave, right? He wants to shave like dad does, as opposed to, you know, put on lipstick like mom. So these things came out later, and then later, once this particular person had discovered that something had been done to him in his childhood, he had opted for surgery once again to be reconstructed into a man, and later on he would grow and he got married. Marriage wasn't a good, it was somewhat in turmoil for a number of years, led to depression, and eventually divorce, and then this man committed suicide in the early 2000s, I believe 2004. So you have these type of issues that can have an impact on the way that we see the Qur'an and interpret the Qur'an, and we have to be very careful or very guarded, I guess you could say, about our own tradition. That Muslims have our own epistemology. We have our own sources of the truth and sources of morality. And we have to take pride in what we have. You know, now that being the case, the troubles with feminism, you know, aside, there are legitimate reasons for women to feel, you know, accosted or feel that there needs to be some serious conversation about women's rights. Again, talking about voting, talking about work, among other things. Now, there's a difference between freedom and agency. Now, freedom, when you say a person is free, fundamentally all it means is that you're not a slave. But to have agency is something different. If you reflect back on, for those of you who are familiar with the life of Malcolm X, for instance, God have mercy on him, that he talked about how when he was a little boy, he once approached his teacher, and he had teachers asking him what he wanted to be when he got older. And he told his teacher that I would like to be a lawyer. And his teacher, the white man, tells him that, well, Malcolm, being a lawyer is not a realistic occupation for N-I-G-G-E-R, right? And rather, you should perhaps look at something else. Let's say maybe like a carpenter. Jesus was a carpenter, right? So he's directed in certain direction, to be given certain type of direction. So in any way, to say, yeah, though Malcolm was a free man or a free boy at the time, and he grew into a free man, meaning he wasn't a slave anymore, but the amount of the number of spheres of interaction that were open for him were very limited. You see, so that's why it's many people, they go to where they go into sports, they go into entertainment, right? Because they didn't have many different other avenues to actually empower themselves. You couldn't become a doctor, or you couldn't become a lawyer, become a college professor, could not become a statesman, among other things. And the same thing was the case for women for most of human history. And for those same reasons, the negative ideas that have that exist about women, they result from the very fact that women were locked out of certain spheres of influence. So I'll give you an example of this. We all are familiar with the hadith that talks about how women are lacking in intelligence and in deen, right? Religiosity, religious observance. It's a hadith sahih, right? It's a sound hadith, right? This is what our scholars say. It's a sound hadith. And it says women lacking in those areas. Now, of course, on one level, you can say, well, how can it be sahih and the Prophet ﷺ say something so demeaning about women? Right? And we could actually argue, perhaps even legitimately, that maybe the Prophet didn't say it like that, and it was just simply the words of the narrator, of the Sahabi, who just recalled something. He paraphrased the Prophet's words. And so, because we know from the Prophet's own character, as he's described in the Qur'an, that he would never berate any person, right? And that's one way to deal with those type of hadith, is to say, hey, okay, well, because most of the hadith, according to our scholars, are marwiyya bin ma'na. They are paraphrased statements of the Prophet, not his exact words. So that's one way out. But another way you can deal with this is say, well, the Prophet actually said it, and he actually said it in that way. However, when he said it, he wasn't talking about something that was natural in women. Rather, he was speaking only according to the actual reality that existed at his time, which is that women themselves, when we look at them and on the basis of the standards of intelligence that were set up by men at the time, then, for instance, because the way that you determine the intelligence generally were that, okay, that you managed wealth. You were good at managing wealth. That's one way that they would determine your relative intelligence. If you're a spendthrift, then you're not an intelligent person, right? Another way they would determine it, they would look at how good of a war strategist you were, right? Or how good of a politician, how shrewd of a politician, right, you may be. So all of these are areas where men themselves predominated. Women did not have any place in those areas. So naturally, you go to a woman and you ask her, well, we're about to fight this war, and what do you think what we should do, right, with the enemy? How should we, approach the enemy in this war? And perhaps a woman says, well, maybe we should send them flowers, right? And for men during that time, they may feel like that is a very unintelligent answer to give, right? And so they assume that the more a woman who gives those type of answers, because of what they themselves are not in those arenas to begin with. They're not allowed in those arenas, those spheres of influence, right? So if the standards of intelligence are those type of things, politics, money management, wealth management, warfare, right? And women are locked out of them, and then when they're asked to give, intelligent answers to them, they don't give answers that are considered to be intelligent. Then you would assume that women must be lacking, right, in intelligence, right? So perhaps the Prophet did say that or something like that, right? And it was based upon those type of those type of assumptions, right? So, but to now universalize and say women are naturally less intelligent than men, which I'm quite sure that anyone who's married would argue that it's the opposite, right? So, because many times my wife has saved me from so many different very dangerous situations, where for me, I was just a pushover, right? She's much more keen and very alert to the dangers of the type of transactions or situations I'm about to get myself into. So it's definitely not something natural. So basically what I'm talking about is just that women themselves, when they complain, and feminism, when it emerges, it's not emerging in a vacuum. It's not emerging in a vacuum. That there are certain things happening, but largely those things are happening in the Christian world, right? So for instance, most of the feminist writers that we know, in the West, they're not responding to Islam, right, necessarily, but they're responding largely to Christianity and especially to Catholicism, because it is within that particular tradition that women are being painted as the cause of man's downfall, right? Women, we should, look out for them. We watch out for them, that they're very dangerous, and, they're the, of course, Eve, she made Adam eat the apple, right? Right? Because of what she did, she was forced into a certain type of bondage to her husband, that she had to obey her husband because of her action. So these things demonizing women, right, they're responding to these type of things. And so Muslim women later on, what they do is they simply appropriate those same assumptions and just say, well, it's the exact thing that happened in Christianity happened in Islam, and so we're going to deal with the problems in the same way that the Christian woman dealt with their problems. And now this is not to say that there are not parallels in our tradition to that, but I would argue that the what we find in our tradition is not. Our normative tradition had not taught that women to be inherently evil, the cause of man's downfall, among other things. That was not our normative tradition. There are some hadiths which give that impression, but they never became orthodoxy, the representative of Islamic orthodoxy. But we do find in our tradition certain scholars who will say things like, well, of course, men are better than women. Yeah, of course, men are more intelligent than women. Of course, men are stronger than women. You know what I'm saying? And well, why else would Allah make all the prophets men? Right? Had it not been for the fact that men are better than women. Right? You'll find those type of statements amongst a number of scholars. Not just a few, a number of scholars. Right? You will find that in our tradition. So there is good reason to have a serious conversation about such issues. But at the end of the day, I think what's most important here is to understand that there's a difference between what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, and what we find scholars themselves saying about women, right? And we do have to make that distinction. We should not be alienated from our religion because of discovering that a number of scholars have had negative things to say about women. And then after that, this assumption of patriarchy being inherently evil, what needs to be understood is that there's no way to reconcile that assumption with the Qur'an. Because once you just throw out there this idea that, that men are caretakers of women, or actually it's an explicit quote, "Ar-rijal qawwamun 'ala an-nisa." That is a direct quote from the Qur'an. It smashes that assumption right from the very beginning, and you can't be committed to the Qur'an and committed to the feminist assumption at the same time. And another assumption is the assumption that Islam has come to create an egalitarian society. And we have to get over this idea. This Islam has not come to create an egalitarian society where everyone is equal, right? Everyone's treated equal, everyone's rewarded the same, everyone does the same exact thing. Islam has not come to do so. Read the Quran, read the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That our religion is comfortable with ideas about hierarchy. is comfortable with ideas about hierarchy, right? We have even spiritual hierarchies in our religion. Like the prophets, they're better than the rest of us, right? The angels are better than most, right? Most human beings, right? And there's some disagreement about whether the prophets are better than the angels or vice versa. You do find that argument, but we have spiritual hierarchies. This is why a number of our scholars, our theologians, would say that never say imani mithla imani Jibreel, that my iman is equivalent to the iman of Jibreel alayhi salam. That rather you can say imani ka imani Jibreel, that my faith is like the faith of Gabriel, but not equivalent to the faith of Gabriel. Because Gabriel, when he believes in Allah and he worships God, he worships Allah with 100% certainty, right? That his Lord exists and his Lord's power is omniscience, among other things. Now, our iman generally is not that certain, right? So we have spiritual hierarchies to begin with, but we also have socio-political hierarchies. We have hierarchies, governments, they're governors over the governed, right? Parents over their children. In a relationship, in the marriage, that the man has a greater responsibility than the wife has, right? There's a certain type of subordination that women somewhat buy into or sign on to when they get married, right? And again, let's try not to get caught up on words. I think that what happens is oftentimes is that we get caught up on words, subordination, hierarchy. What are you talking about? And we make these assumptions that hierarchy, for instance, implies betterness, right? That it means, so if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me or placed me in a position where I have more authority to influence your life, that it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves you more than he loves me. You know, and that's the mistake. Some men have, many have made that mistake in seeing their role as qawwam, right, as a role of superiority, of I'm better, of betterness, right? I'm superior to the woman. And I've actually, when I was younger, even heard as an older brother, he said in my presence that, and because this is something, it's around. He had said in my presence that, a woman can never, I don't believe a woman can ever be better than a man. And then when I asked him, I said, well, based upon what? He said, because of the hadith, that, because she can never pray more than I can pray, and she can never fast more than I can fast. Well, I mean, for me, it's like, just look at my wife. I mean, she prays and fasts more than I do all the time, because, understand is that she's just much more spiritual than me. So it which really belies or actually contradicts what I understand and know of that. So it is possible that a woman can pray and fast even more than a man can do so. But you do have these sort of ideas floating around there. They've been around for a very long time as well. And when we reinforce these type of ideas, then they create distance between us. They ruin the type of trust that we should be trying to promote among ourselves, right? So it should be a relationship built upon true of love, of affection. People should feel that I'm looking out for your best interest, you see. So instead of a position of authority as qawwam, it should be looked upon as a position of responsibility. It is a position of responsibility. And if I fall short of my responsibility and my wife does not, then she's better than I am. She's better than I am, right? And so we just have to try our best not to equate having different roles and have different positions in society as being signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves one more than the other. Because men pray in the front and women pray in the back doesn't mean that women are worse than men, when men are better than women. If anything, it means women are stronger than the men, because otherwise Allah, the Prophet ﷺ would reverse it, right? So you know what? Men should pray behind the woman. But the very fact that women are less distracted generally than men are by such an arrangement means that spiritually they're stronger. They can focus more than we can, right? But we should not interpret that as a sign of superiority. Why do men get to lead the prayer and we don't get to lead the prayer? You understand? So there are a number of those questions that are out there. And so, and then I'll end just by sort of just mentioning to you some of the things that led me to both write and to speak about this particular subject. Right now, and this is even leading up to the recent Trump victory, that there in the Muslim, in America in particular, there are a number of young people studying on university campuses who are heavily inundated with the feminist and other sort of neoliberal ideas. And many of these children, many of these young people don't have a firm grounding in Islam to begin with, to really be able to offer a cogent response to a lot of these challenges. And because of that, many times we see them caving in to the pressure and adopting and appropriating these type of epistemologies, and whether it be liberalism in general or feminism in particular. And we found at certain campuses well, I know one in particular where, because of what appears to be feminist pressures, that the person in charge had decided to, instead of having the sisters pray behind them, but to put a barrier between the men and the women so the women can stand parallel to the brothers, to the men, right? Because they didn't want to feel inferior, right? That's one thing, and it's somewhat benign, you know, because you can ask, well, is it valid? Yes, it's valid. But is it based upon the direction given to us by our Prophet, ﷺ? Is an important question. Now, of course, all those sisters perhaps didn't do it because they wanted to feel equal. Some of the sisters may have felt like, you know, it actually helps them to focus better. You know, I believe that that's perhaps a sincere intention of some of them. On the other hand, we found that in one particular situation, which was reported, was that an MSA at one of our universities decided that they wanted to have a special week, a celebration called Queer Week. The MSA president was a sister, and when she went and she had discussed this issue with the majority of the members of the MSA, found that the majority of them were okay with it. They wanted to celebrate not only queer non-Muslims, but queer Muslims, right? Muslims who have adopted the homosexual lifestyle. She couldn't stomach it, so she stepped down as the president of the MSA at that particular university. But these are, again, some of those challenges, some of those issues that eventually led to me to write about this particular topic. And I do think it is a topic of immense concern. And I do believe as well that because the liberals themselves have pushed so hard, have been pushing so hard, this is one of the reasons that Trump is president right now, right? Because, as I've stated before, saying that America, make America great again, does not only mean make America white again, but also means make America straight again, right? So because there are many people, a significant number of people in America, not just Muslims, a lot of conservative people, Christians and otherwise, who are not pleased with the situation, right, and what's happening with regard to the sexual ethics and sexual norms in America. You know, and that was part of the reason, one of the reasons that led to the victory that we've seen recently, is unprecedented victory. And Allah knows best what the future has in store. So I just like to offer that as an introduction, and I'm certain that there are going to be some questions, important questions that will be asked, inshallah, during the intro. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And so we'll go right ahead and start with Professor Giovanni.
I have a million questions, right? But I'm sure that there's so many questions here that I'm only going to ask two for now, right? Would any of the sisters like to go first?
No, it's okay. Yes, I'll go after you.
Please, sister.
No, you're here up before mine.
Okay. The manner in which you explain the hadith of women's intelligence and deen being inferior, right? this speaks of context, right?
Yes.
And a situational,
Right.
Now, I would say that most feminists that want to participate in Islamic discourse are not going to ultimately say that their epistemology gives absolute precedence over the Qur'an, but ultimately they're going to say that they have an alternative hermeneutic, right? Yes. That the original hermeneutic was ultimately a male-centered hermeneutic, right? And that in itself, much as you said that feminism is going to become some sort of lens, right, which obfuscates, right, blocks certain things, that patriarchy is going to obfuscate certain things, right? And so many of the liberals, right, and the liberal reformers are ultimately going to say that such things like, for example, qawamun is also situational, right? As you know, right? They're going to say that men, are given, guardianship over women, in a particular case where men are the breadwinners, but that ultimately, if you manage to have some sort of society, right, by way of necessity, right, let's not say that capitalism has brought women into the workforce out of a desire for equality, but out of a desire to, make more wage earners, so people can shop more, right? Mm-hmm. So ultimately, if you have, by way of necessity, women entering the workforce and making more than men, such as, for example, in black communities where in the United States, wherein there's a systematic attempt to prevent men from the workforce and allow women into the workforce, right? So the feminists, they are going to say, and the liberals are going to say, that then situations change, right? And they're going to use the same logic which you used, right? Yes. So one, I would like for you to address that. Two, how about...
That was like 5 questions in one.
That was a single question. I just wanted to give context, right?
Is that a question or statement?
No, it's a question. No, it's a statement, and then I want him to expound on it, right? Rebuttal it, right? The other, and this one is certainly a question, right? What do you think of the use of the manner in which Hanafis use umum al-balwa, right? For looking at these type of hadith, right? Wherein the idea is, as you know, that when a hadith is so widespread or would create such widespread change in society in a detrimental manner, that one has to be more cautious in terms of testing it. So that, for example, if it's ahad, one would ask, why would the Prophet ﷺ, say something which is going to fundamentally change society, and only a single man is the one that's reporting it, right? So what do you think of using umum al-balwa, or those that attempt to use such a method to deal with these hadith?
Right. Yeah. Okay. The first issue with regard to women claiming that the epistemology that was, or the hermeneutic, I guess you can say, which was being employed at first was a male-centered hermeneutic, and that, or patriarchal sort of hermeneutic, which led to these oppressive interpretations, quote unquote. One, I would just say that there's no, the further back you go, especially, there's no ironclad proof that this was rooted in some idea or some sort of mass conspiracy on the part of men to just simply say, this woman, they're pretty dangerous, we got to do something about them. So let's make up these hadiths that's going to make them, continue to serve us and we stay on top. I mean, one, men didn't have to do that because men are always stronger than women physically. You understand? Because we could just force women to do whatever they want to do to begin with. So why do I need to create an interpretation that makes sure that I still dominate women? Second of all, this particular idea fundamentally presumes that there is no other basis for the existence of these type of hadith than self-interest. The self-interest of scholars, of male scholars, right? As opposed to faith. Why can't it be that these group of men inherited a tradition from their forefathers, and they were told that the Prophet ﷺ directed them to do this and that. And on faith, and generally on faith, they say, you know what? we're not supposed to allow women to do this, this, that, and that. Why? Because Allah and His Messenger said so. Right. Now, you can disagree with the interpretation, but the motivation of those scholars, I would, argue, was largely faith-driven. Right. It wasn't like self-interest. It's like, it's a hadith, and if the scholar says sahih, I'm going to act on it, and we're going to apply it. Right. If a hadith says that any people who appoints women to lead their affairs will never be successful. Hey, well, if the Prophet said it, we can't, you understand? We can't allow it. Again, you can talk about the authenticity of the hadith and whatever, but the idea that it was just simply rooted in self-interest, right? Yes, it didn't affect men, it did affect women, right? But then the other part of it too is that there have been numbers of women who were the first teachers of the Ummah, right? Of many of the scholars who actually later become great, famous people. You look in the Bibles, so many different people, you see that they have that women teachers, right? And there's no indication that those women necessarily disagreed or also did not take a lot of this information on faith. The type of feminism you find actually with the Sahabiyat is like, well, Ya Rasulullah, why is it that men get to go to jihad and they go straight to Jannah and we don't get the same opportunity? You understand? That's feminism too. And the Prophet said, listen, Hajj is your jihad. Or other things that he mentioned, but that's your jihad. This is jihad for men. Men have this responsibility, not you, right? But they wanted to go out and risk their lives, just like the men were risking their lives, so they can get an equal reward. See? So, but it was rooted in faith. So that's the first issue. How I respond to that first part of the comment that you made earlier. I'm trying to remember the second part of it, which was what?
Situational. The way that you described it, the way that you interpreted it, was by way of speaking of context. But these feminists say ultimately that the Quran is also contextual.
Right. Well, but again, the idea that the only reason that women are expected to obey their husbands is because their husbands provide for them financially. The verse itself belies that claim, because the verse goes on and says, "Ar-rijalu qawwamuna 'ala an-nisa'i bima faddala Allahu ba'dahum 'ala ba'd wa bima anfaqu min amwalihim." So the verse actually goes on and says that men are the caretakers of women. First, we call jumla ismiya, jumla khabariya, right? It's a nounal sentence which typically is taken to be something unconnected with time, right? It's a timeless verse, right? To begin with, men were the maintainers of women. Men will be or could be the maintainers of women. It said, "Ar-rijalu qawwamuna 'ala an-nisa," a universal principle established in the verse to begin with. Second of all, Allah gives reason. The first reason is bima faddala Allahu ba'dahum 'ala ba'd. By what merit Allah gives to some over others. By what advantage Allah gives to some over others. That is to say, because Allah gives fadl to some people over other people. In this case, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave men this particular role, and He didn't give it to women. So as if to say, why are men in that position? Because Allah said so. Men are in that role because Allah said so, first of all, because He can do whatever He wants to do. Then He says, and because of what they spend of their wealth. Right. So there are two reasons, not just one reason. Right. So, but of course, because there are a lot of situations that you're talking about where the women are the bread earners, and men are still demanding obedience, and they're not doing a lot of things that they should be doing. This is what creates the imbalance, right? So again, she's better than him, and he thinks he's better than her just because he's a man, right? Right. And then if we find people promoting such ideas in our exegesis, then it becomes even more problematic, you see, because it reinforces, hey, well, of course, man, you can never be, I don't have to do anything. I'm going to be better than you regardless. So it's a problem, you see, and that's what creates a lot of distrust and destroys relationships. So men have to step up their game, you see. But when it comes down to just simply looking at the verse itself objectively, and talking about an ideal, the Quran gives an ideal, and Allah offers the explanation for it, because, you know, Allah can give fadl to some people and over others. Women have fadl in certain areas, and men have fadl in certain areas, right? So, and so Allah has preferred women. And like, think of, for instance, the area of child custody rights. The four schools, clearly, they say, okay, woman. You know, they preferred woman. You know, so if a man and woman divorce, okay, the custody goes to the mother. Okay, the mother, if she's disqualified for some reason, and then it goes to the grandmother. All right, and then if the grandmother is disqualified, oh, then it goes to the aunt, maternal aunt, right? Then, you know, and, you know, go past through all these different people, and then finally the father, right? This is our schools of Islam. You know, the jurisprudence, it wasn't male-centered, it wasn't patriarchal. It's like it took into consideration interests of the child, right? Who people were considered to be the greater nurturers, right? You understand? So, and even in inheritance law, people, oh, inheritance law is unequal. Men always get twice the amount of women. No, it's not always the case. You know, uterine brothers and sisters, the same mother, different fathers, they all get the same share. You know, if there's a person dies and leaves a brother and a sister, they're from the same mother but different father, the brother gets 1/6, the sister gets 1/6. So it's not a universal rule, right? And that's just one example. There are many examples of this, you see. So there are all these issues that are there that just people just don't really fully understand, and that are completely educated about them. And then the last thing was what?
The umum al-balwa.
Right. Right. So the issue of when a particular hadith promotes an idea which will have a dramatic sort of impact on on society and social relations, like this one, an example about, you know, women's intelligence, or a hadith about not allowing women to take on positions of authority, or a hadith about how a woman was created from a rib, and the rib is the most crooked part of the rib is the head in one narration. Most narrations actually don't mention that, but you know, you find these hadiths, and feminist Muslims women have taken have placed in their sort of you know, they're taking Abu Huraira in particular as the target, as like amongst the Sahaba, as being a misogynist amongst the Sahaba. So Abu Huraira is not an authority for most Muslim feminists. Right. Now, this is not strange, because they weren't the first to raise issues with Abu Huraira, and the Shia as well. You know, the Qur'anists in general take a position about Abu Huraira. They say, oh, Abu Huraira, you don't even know what his name was. You know, and if you look in his biography, they attend to more names. You know, they say, oh, his name is Abdullah bin Sakhar. You know, but we respond and say, well, because you don't know his name doesn't mean he wasn't real. Right? I mean, I know plenty of people I grew up in the hood with, you know, and they know my street name. I don't know their real names, but I know, you know, that Mook and that Spook over there, and that's, you understand? I know plenty of people who have, you understand what I'm talking about? Because you don't know their real name doesn't mean they weren't real people, you see? So oftentimes these hadiths are not only reported by Abu Huraira, especially the hadith about the rib. You know, because actually I've done sort of inductive survey of like the hadiths on the rib. And it really, and it's clear that it wasn't Abu Huraira who had that to say. There's no narration, a version from Aisha radiallahu anha as well, who's saying the same exact thing. A number of other Sahaba, Sabra bin Jundub, Jabir bin Abdullah, a number of different narrations from different Sahaba on that particular issue. I think definitely we should. I think we do have good reason for pause and consideration when we come across a hadith which will have potentially an extremely negative impact on people, and look at their authenticity, and then look to see how many people do relate it, because we don't want to elevate a hadith to the level of an aqidah, right? If they're not mutawatir, or at least something bordering on mutawatir, we don't want to make that mistake, because you find hadiths about, you know, different types of people as well. They're berated, like black people. You find some hadiths with some scholars, hadiths are Hasan, you know, la khayra fil habash, there's no good in black people, there's no good in Abyssinians. It's hadith, they laid it and attributed it to the Prophet. Some scholars say it's a hadith, is is a sound hadith, right? But again, it never became orthodoxy. Never became a representative of Islamic Orthodox tradition, and there's sort of this minority scholars or fringe scholars who actually would accept the authenticity of those type of hadith. So anything that's promoted in Aqidah, especially about another group, a large group of people and stereotyping people, then definitely we should take pause and not elevate that hadith to that level. So this is why I said that those hadith about women being deficient in intelligence, among other things, is probably more appropriate to take them as situational. That the Prophet was talking about a reality that he himself had understood and he had witnessed himself, but not to establish that this was part of human nature. This was that female's nature was to be this way, right? Because he never said anything about the woman's nature is to be that way, right? So, yes.
Two points. You did mention about that the group with the prayer, putting the barrier. Well, I have a problem with that because I'm older than you. But I lived in Saudi back in the 70s, and in the Prophet's Mosque and in Mecca, well, Mecca, of course, everybody, the women had one side and the men pray next to them. And the Shias also do that. Traditionally, that is the thing. So it was never women praying behind the men. That came later on. And that I do have an issue with.
It came later on when? Like when?
In the history, I don't know if it was just during, I know that from what I've read that during Umar's time, he did tell the women that they could stay home now, they didn't have to come to the mosque to pray. So things, like what he was mentioning, there were things that were going on for whatever reasons, I don't know, culturally.
Right, so you're aware of the history of the hadith of خَيْرُ صُفُوفِ الرِّجَالِ أُوَّلُهَا وَشَرُّهَا آخِرُهَا. The best ranks of the men are those in the front, and the worst of them are those in the back. وَخَيْرُ صُفُوفِ النِّسَاءِ آخِرُهَا وَشَرُّهَا أُوَّلُهَا. And the best ranks of the women are those in the back, and the worst of them are those in the front. What about that hadith? You know, it just came. What century? What century was it invented? If it was later, what century was the hadith invented?
So where does that say that the women paid behind the men, and why would you say that they would change? Because
that's just one. But I mean, it's well established.
But I'm saying, why would they do one thing and now change it?
Well, why would they change it? I mean, that's the whole point. Is that it's been this way for centuries. It's been this way from the very beginning, and people only are now trying to change it.
No, that's the way it wasn't. It's always been
okay.
That way.
I mean, I beg to disagree, and I can back it up. But I don't believe that you can back up your claim.
I'm just
you were in the Prophet's time.
No, I'm saying in Medina that now things have changed, and I have to ask you why.
Listen, we can't judge what is Islam on the basis of what Muslims are doing right now. Islam, what is understood to be Islam, is what we receive from Allah and His Messenger. That is what it's. That's no person can differ about that, because Allah gave the knowledge of Islam to His Prophet. So whatever the Prophet initiated and introduced us to, that's what Islam. People can change. People have constantly changed what Islam or the Prophet's direction. Right? But if you can't argue on the basis of something you witnessed in your life today and say that, okay, because when I was younger, they did this, and then now they're reverted back to this other thing, or they changed the thing, that is proof that Islam, the original Islam, was what I witnessed when I was a young kid, living in 2016. Right? That's not a scholastic historical argument. I'm telling you that there actually are hadiths, and their historical reports was well established that was the norm. You can have a problem with it. Listen, you can have a problem with it. I'm just with me. This is not personal with me in the sense that I'm just saying, listen, this is about me remaining committed to my faith. You understand? That I became a Muslim. Well, put it like this: I was born a Muslim, and I accepted Islam in my life. And I decided that my Islam is not complete until it conforms with the desire of my Creator, right? Now I'll be troubled at times. That's what's called Islam, submission, right? Submission is not always easy. But that's what I'm trying to do, and I have a trust, a sacred trust, to convey to you the religion as I understand it to be. I know it. We can differ. I don't have a problem with people differing with me. If someone can prove to me that in the Prophet's time that women and men prayed against separate, side by side, or even prove to me that the Shia also, this is what they claim, you know, which is the first time I've ever heard, right? Then I'm willing to submit, right? But until then, we have to go with what we know and what we understand. Is there?
No, you're missing my point. So when he brought up the whole subject of people taking it and then running with it, making showing that it's culturally, I feel it's very cultural, but you have to understand if you see something in one decade and 10, 20 years later, it's completely changed around. And this is a lot of, Muslims, when they go to Medina and they go to Mecca and they see this and they say, okay, well, this must be the way it is. And you have a lot of scholars who don't, what's the word? Well, a lot of them actually do study in Medina, unfortunately. I'm going to say that unfortunately because a lot of the stuff that comes out of there now is definitely warped from what it was before. But it's just, you can't say that it's not anti-women when you see one behavior, one thing, and then you come down 10, 20, 30 years later.
Well, I mean, I can't say it's anti-women because I wasn't there to witness exactly what you're talking about. Now, you may feel it may have been anti-women because of the attitudes of the men themselves when they decided to make that change. But I think one thing you have to entertain is the possibility that they were correcting something. Is it possible that they realized, we were doing this wrong, and now we're trying to make it right? Right? There are a number of masajid who have barriers between the men and the women. The women still pray in the back, but they have barriers. And some people say, the Prophet's time, they didn't have the barriers. And some people say, we're going to make it like that. And they feel they're correcting something. Some women still prefer the barrier. You see, I studied in Morocco, and the Qarawiyyin Mosque, if you go there, it's one of the strangest prayers you ever pray. Anybody been there before? You've been to Qarawiyyin? So like, everybody, stand up for a second. So like when people pray, it's like this, you're going to face like this, and I'm like this. Well, he's praying, we're all praying like this. But the Qibla, the niche is right there against the wall. But what happened was this. They discovered later on when technology got better that the Qibla was off. So they decided, you know what? It's like this. So everybody stands in line. It's like you're like back behind, praying behind one another like this, as opposed to shoulder to shoulder. They pray this way. Yeah. And so sometimes people discover that, we had it wrong, and so now we're correcting it. I mean, is that not a possibility? It can't be a possibility in your mind.
No.
Okay. All right. No problem.
I've lived here so long to see that things have changed in every community, and to the point that the women not only do not pray in the same room, they pray. They don't. Some masajids don't even allow women in their masajids.
Okay. I mean, I think those are different
this
issues.
Is a serious
I think those are
issue,
different issues. Yes, it's remaining.
So what do you advise for college campuses between, including the gay Muslim men and women? How do you suggest that we deal with that issue without hurting these people's feelings?
Right. How do we deal with gay? What are you talking about? Gay Muslim and women and men? Well, I think that there are two different types of gay Muslim women and men. There's one type who acknowledges that Islam does not allow what they do, and they themselves are struggling with their urges, and they're not trying to make the haram halal. These people, if they approach us, we speak with them, we welcome them, we do not divulge their secrets, and we help them deal with their struggles. Right? We take them in as brothers and sisters. On the other hand, you have a group of them who claim to be Muslims who are like, yeah, I'm a Muslim, and you know what? I openly profess that this is okay, and I should be allowed to do it. You need to just get caught up with the times. It's lawful in America now, right? those Muslims, or so-called Muslims, you know, those people, I think that we have just tell them bluntly, no, it's not allowed. You cannot justify it, and we will not accept it. Right.
I mean, I'm sorry, but they are Muslims, right? They still.
Well, I mean, if someone says that he or she is a Muslim, then they're a Muslim. I mean, and, you know, but again, we also believe that you can believe a thing which actually contravenes the divine will, right? Clearly goes against the divine will, and it leads you into kufr. We don't label people ourselves. I say, listen, you know, what you just said is kufr, right? What you are doing, your believing, your understanding is kufr, right? Right? Are you a kafir? I don't know. I mean, I don't know how Allah sees you at this moment. I can't say. I can't say how Allah sees you at this moment. And I think that that should be the approach that we take with people. You know, but there are clearly things that put you out of Islam. You know, because if Allah is telling you haram, and you say, you know what, I say it's halal. Either Allah is a liar or you are. Right? And if you insist that Allah is a liar, then it's kufr. You understand? You see? So, and this is fundamentally the predicament that we find ourselves in, and a lot of Muslims find themselves in this day. So, listen, okay, you're a Muslim, if you want to pray, okay, pray. But listen, I mean, it's like a person who drinks and fornicates, and commits adultery, and lies, compulsive lying, or whatever it may be. Backbiting, I mean, all of it is sin. Right? We tolerate it. But the average Muslim is not trying to tell you that, hey man, backbiting is okay, lying is okay, cheating on your wife is okay, drinking wine is okay. Muslims are not saying that. You know, and even for those people who say that, okay, well, it's not worse than shirk. Well, I mean, yeah, they do what they do, but it's not, shirk is worse than that. Okay, shirk, yes, it is worse than homosexual sex. You know, yes, it is worse than it, but we're not being asked to make shirk okay. We're not being asked to make drinking wine is okay, or that adultery or fornication is okay. We've been asked to say that homosexual acts are okay. So yeah, that is worse, but that's not being demanded of us. This is being demanded of it, so that's why you will find a very harsh reaction to it. So I think, again, if people are suggesting to us that we should just get over it, I say, no, we're not going to get over it. And no, we're not going to tolerate it. See? But if, on the other hand, if people are, hey, you know what, listen, I'm not doing well, I'm struggling with this. I'm just like if somebody's on drugs. Right? Somebody's addicted to heroin or crack or whatever. Listen, I need some help. Yes, we take them in, we embrace you, we try our best to help you, whatever those issues are. See? And I think that's an aspect of our community growth we still haven't matured to. It's like sometimes we discover that somebody's gay, and we'll go and spread the news. The person actually, you know, is not trying to justify what they do. Because I've actually had people write me, like after I wrote about the topic itself. And I remember as a brother who he read my piece, and he wrote me an email. This individual I actually was in contact with for a long time, and I never realized that he had this experience. And so he wrote to me, he said, listen, I want to let you know that before I was a Muslim, I used to sleep with men, and then I became a Muslim. And then after I became a Muslim, I stopped doing it because somebody told me that I could be killed. So it scares them out of messing around with men. So I've been attempting to find a compatible mate, a woman, right, to get married to, but there's certain people in the community who know about my past, and every time they sense even that I'm trying to get married to someone, they go and put the word out, right? So you understand? So and now again, I'm not saying that we should not share certain information with certain people we believe may not be content to find out those type of details, but it's just the whole culture that we have of just divulging people's personal business, you know, and running people away. I think that they're just two different types of situations. Yes.
So I just have one
Yeah.
more statement. Would you think that culturally, fornication is not as frowned upon as being a gay?
Right.
For some reason, like we are so trained to think that this is kind of a bigger crime. Then, I mean, if that man has fornicated, he would have gotten with a woman, he would have gotten married without any problem.
Right.
Would you think that that has some?
Well, I think that the reason that people treat homosexuality as worse than fornication and even adultery is because we as people have our own ideas about human nature. And what it seems to us is that this is an individual who's not only committing a sin, but this is a person who is violating human nature, right? And that is what the additional outrage originates from. Is that, you are somewhat of, you committed an abomination here, in some regards. And that's why people are so very, very stern and severe in their reaction. But we have to be very careful about the type of people that we divulge such information to, if there are people struggling with those type of desires. And there are Muslims who have like these groups, like online, and some of them, and one particular group I'm aware of, the moderators have a rule that if anyone comes on this particular group and attempts to try to justify what they do, they get kicked off. So these are all Muslims struggling with same-sex attraction, right? Right. And so some of them, again, so this is those type of situations will resolve those type of issues, perhaps even marriage, you see, because if a person lived that type of lifestyle and now wants to marry one who has never lived that lifestyle and trying to keep it a secret from them, that can become something that destroys the relationship in the future if they don't let them know, or if they find out from a third party about this. But if they marry people with similar pasts, then it's easier for them to live together because one is not going to be overly judgmental of the other, right? So, yes.
I have a question going on the whole cultural, the idea of culture, right? Pre-modern scholars were quite open to the fact that some from among us are attracted to the same sex, right? I mean, you read manuals and you'd be awed by how often, scholars of fiqh are telling you about, you beardless, beardless young men, right? And for us, it appears strange, right? And you see, for example, in like Sufi poetry, like finding Allah in the beauty of a young man, and so on and so forth, right? Or in attempts at Sufi poetry, and so on and so forth, right? Would you say that that making humans aware, right? Again, normalizing the fact that not all of us have the same tendencies, I mean, being able to speak about it, that some from among us, perhaps it's not you, right? The way that it was done in the past would perhaps be a good attempt, right? I'm not normalizing, sin. That's not what I'm referring to, right?
Right. Yeah, but I guess you would say again, not normalizing the sin, but it's acknowledging that impulses themselves are not sinful, right? You understand that you're not going to be held accountable for the attraction itself, as long as you don't resolve to act upon the impulse, right? And they're the two different things. And we can't control our thoughts. Sometimes, we have some very filthy and just unsavory types of, impulses. All people have different things like that. But Islam doesn't punish a person for revealing that, I thought about doing this. But Islam has punished or threatened punishment in the afterlife for actually acting upon the impulses that we have, you see. So the literature about the beardless young boys in Maidan, actually there's a term for it. SubhanAllah. I think you mentioned the word. What's the word for it? It's like male relationships with younger boys. There's a word in English for it. At any rate, this is something, it was normative in the Greek culture. It's something that actually became normative in certain Islamic cultures as well. And so we do find it in our literature, but there's definitely a distinction between acting on one's impulses and actually just simply having the impulse to do those type of things. Did you have a question, Sissy?
Dr.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I see some of the people are coming from New Jersey area.
Okay.
So can we have the last question so that the conversation can go after that, but at least we can give the people option of they want to, they don't want to really, I'm assuming, disturb the community. So let's have the last question, and then conversations can go on.
Yes.
Quran seems to speak in gender language to a certain degree.
Yes.
However, as women living in 21st century, the rights that our secular governments seem to, give us more rights in terms of inheritance, divorce. How can we understand the implications of this economy?
Oh, that's a very good question. And the Quran speaks in gendered language generally, and we live in the 21st century in the West, and it seems that Western governments tend to give women more rights than the rights that it seems that Islam seemed to give to them, right? Like sort of equality, inheritance laws, and things like that, and how we should be understand this or deal with this particular assumption, I guess you would say. I will first begin by saying that, and I think someone alluded to this earlier today, about how things have changed and how there are, women who are taking care of men and vice versa. So if women are taking care of men, then perhaps the obligations of obedience towards one's husband is not something that can really be considered to be binding anymore, or at least in those particular situations. There's a tendency of people living in the West to project on the rest of the world. But reality is that in the majority of the world today, women still largely depend on their husbands. The world throughout, majority of the world. It's only in the West that we find, this particular phenomenon in certain parts of society. And so we shouldn't be like how we typically do with sports, and America is the world champion of everything, right? But we are playing only ourselves. In basketball, we're the world champions. In football, we're the world champions, among so many other types of sports. But the other issue about the laws seeming to prefer, or not even seeming to, but oftentimes actually do seem to prefer women over men, that I think that there are certain dangers that result from this. And there's actually a lecture by a woman, it's a Canadian woman, she's a Jewish woman named Barbara Kay, and is entitled Women's Rights to Feminist Wrongs. And she's highlighting how, because of the feminist movement, many of the laws, especially in the area of child custody, have created a major imbalance between relationship between father and mother with relationship to their children. And she gives a number of examples of how oftentimes men are punished for not doing what society expects for them to do or believes that they're supposed to do towards the children, and women would do similar things and they don't get punished. And so, like she gave one example about there's a man who was in a relationship in the past and he had a child, and then he was forced to pay child support for that child, and then he got married again or had a child with another woman, and then in his new relationship he broke up with her, and so he has 2 children. The courts decide to charge him not only 100% of his monthly salary, meaning they just take it completely, but more than 100% of his salary, assuming that he's getting paid more than what he's reporting. right? Now, of course, this stressed the man out to the point that he eventually committed suicide. And they talked about how there's a lot of suicide in this area with regard to divorce and child custody in particular, because men turn out to be oppressed. They're very oppressed in this particular area. Another example, she talked about how there was a couple, a man and a woman, they had like a one-night stand, and the woman gets pregnant, and the woman decides she doesn't want the baby. She wants to give the baby up for adoption. The biological father of the child decides to say, no, listen, if you don't give it up for adoption, just give it to me, right? But because the woman has a right to her own body and control of her own body, and because she's privileged more in that area, they allowed for her to give the child up for adoption. You know, and what they did was say they looked at, okay, this particular family that she's giving the child up to is they can pay more money than the father. The father wasn't poor, but this the other family, the child will live a better life with this family. So this is his flesh and blood, and they give the flesh and blood to a family was unrelated to the child. You know, so there's a couple examples. You know, so you find in this particular area there are a lot of areas in our societies today where there is an extreme imbalance in the gender relations, and to the extent that you can say that men are oppressed. Right, largely about a lot of these different things, and the assumptions that judges have, they make about I guess you would say the nurturing potential of mothers compared to that of fathers, is not oftentimes based upon any real science, right? And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that men, in many of these cases, the majority of these cases she was speaking about, actually were proven to be better nurturers than the mothers themselves in those relationships. So this, again, it's not specifically about inheritance, but we need to understand that there's a double-edged sword. Yes, we want rights, we want a certain level of equality, but understanding that we don't want to go to the extreme of transgression and injustice, you know, because it can lead to a lot of imbalance in our society. Right? Okay. All right. So I appreciate you all hanging around and, you know, putting up with me, but it was enjoyable, and hopefully it won't be the last trip to the school, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Sallallahu alaihi wa sallam. Muhammad alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum.